A world on edge. The mahogany desk in the Oval Office gleamed under the soft light of an April evening in 1945. Behind it sat a man who just 13 days earlier had been a relatively obscure vice president from Missouri. Harry S. Truman ran his fingers along the polished wood, still adjusting to the weight of a presidency he had never truly expected to inherit. The leather chair creaked softly as he shifted, his eyes moving across the stack of classified briefings that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Franklin Roosevelt was gone, and with him the steady hand that had guided America through the darkest chapters of the Second World War. Truman had been kept deliberately distant from the most sensitive wartime decisions. Now, as he faced the towering responsibility of ending a global conflict, he was discovering just how much had been hidden from him in the shadows of Roosevelt's inner circle. The war in Europe was collapsing with breathtaking speed. Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Berlin. American and British armies were racing across Germany, liberating concentration camps and accepting the surrender of entire Wehrmacht divisions. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, was crumbling after just 12 years of existence. Yet even as victory celebrations were being planned for the European theater, another war raged with undiminished fury across the Pacific. In the Philippines, American forces were still fighting house to house through Manila's ruins. On Iwo Jima, a sulphurous island barely 8 square miles in size, nearly 7,000 American servicemen had died capturing an airfield. The Japanese defenders had fought with a ferocity that shocked even veteran commanders. Of the 22,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, fewer than 200 had surrendered. The rest had chosen death over capitulation, fighting from caves and tunnels until the very end. Truman studied the casualty reports with growing unease. If this was the cost of taking a small volcanic island, what would be the price of invading Japan itself? The Joint Chiefs of Staff were already presenting him with preliminary plans for Operation Downfall, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 2 million American troops would assault the Japanese home islands. Conservative estimates projected American casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Japanese military and civilian losses could reach into the millions. The president closed the folder containing these projections and rubbed his tired eyes. Outside the windows, Washington's cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their delicate pink petals drifting across the White House grounds. It seemed almost cruel that such beauty could exist in a world still consumed by such violence. Somewhere across the Pacific, young American soldiers were preparing for battles that might never need to be fought. If only there were another way. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had requested an urgent meeting for the following morning. The message had been cryptic, mentioning only matters of the highest classification and developments that could fundamentally alter our strategic position. Truman had learned to read between the lines of such carefully worded communications. This was about something Roosevelt had kept from him, something significant enough to warrant the secretary's obvious anxiety. The Manhattan Project. Even the name had been hidden from him during his vice presidency. Truman had heard whispers, of course. As a senator, he had noticed the enormous budget allocations flowing to facilities in Tennessee and Washington state. When he had attempted to investigate these expenditures, he had been quietly but firmly warned away by Stimson himself. Senator Truman, the secretary had said, "I can't tell you what it is, but it is the greatest project in the history of the world. The less you know about it, the better." Now, as president, he was about to discover what $2 billion and the brightest scientific minds in America had been creating in absolute secrecy. The preliminary briefings had been almost impossible to believe, a weapon that derived its power from the fundamental forces holding matter together, a single bomb that could devastate an entire city. The theoretical possibility had become terrifying reality in the laboratories of Los Alamos, nestled in the remote mountains of New Mexico. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, had described the weapon's potential in language that seemed borrowed from science fiction. The explosive yield would be equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives. The heat generated at the moment of detonation would rival that of the sun's surface. Buildings would be vaporized instantly within a radius of several miles. The long-term effects, those were still being studied. Truman stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight of this knowledge was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Here was the power to end the war swiftly, to save countless American lives that would otherwise be lost in the bloody invasion of Japan. Yet the moral implications were staggering. No weapon of such destructive capability had ever existed. The decision of whether to use it would rest entirely with him. The Japanese government showed no signs of surrender despite their increasingly desperate military position. Their cities were being systematically destroyed by massive B-29 bombing raids. The March firebombing of Tokyo had killed more people in a single night than any previous air attack in history. Yet still, the Japanese military leadership spoke of fighting to the death, of turning their home islands into a fortress where every man, woman, and child would resist the American invasion. Intelligence reports painted a picture of a nation preparing for national suicide rather than surrender. Civilian populations were being trained to fight with bamboo spears. Military commanders spoke openly of accepting 20 million Japanese deaths if it would force America to negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. The concept of surrender itself seemed incompatible with the Japanese military code that had driven their forces to fight so fanatically throughout the Pacific Campaign. Truman returned to his desk and opened another folder, this one containing diplomatic cables from Moscow. Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Soviet participation might help convince Tokyo that further resistance was hopeless. But Truman was beginning to understand that Stalin's friendship came with a price. Soviet forces were already installing communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. Did America really want Soviet armies occupying Japanese territory as well? The atomic bomb offered a different path, a way to end the war before Soviet involvement became necessary. Yet using such a weapon would cross a threshold from which there could be no return. America would become the first nation to harness the fundamental forces of the universe for warfare. The precedent would be set. Other nations would inevitably develop their own atomic weapons. The world would never be the same. As evening deepened over Washington, Truman found himself thinking about the young Americans still fighting across the Pacific. Boys from Kansas farms and New York tenements, from California suburbs and Texas ranches. They had already given so much. Many would never see home again. Their lives ended on beaches and jungle hills whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. How many more would die if the war continued? How many Japanese civilians would perish in the flames of conventional bombing? How many would starve as the naval blockade tightened around their island nation? The president picked up a photograph from his desk, a picture of himself as a young artillery officer in France during the First World War. He had seen enough of war's reality to understand that all choices in wartime were terrible choices. The question was not how to avoid tragedy, but how to minimize it. Yet this decision felt different. This was not about tactics or strategy, but about the fundamental nature of warfare itself. Tomorrow, he would receive the full briefing on America's atomic capability. He would learn the technical details of how matter could be transformed into energy, how the very building blocks of creation could become instruments of destruction. Scientists would explain the physics. Military advisors would present the strategic options. Intelligence analysts would assess Japan's capacity for continued resistance. But ultimately, the decision would be his alone. A former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, would decide whether to unleash upon the world a force that could reshape the very nature of human conflict. The responsibility was almost overwhelming. Yet it was the burden that democracy had placed upon his shoulders. As Truman prepared to leave the Oval Office for the night, he paused at the doorway and looked back at the desk where so many momentous decisions had been made. Tomorrow would bring new revelations about the secret weapon that might end the war. Tonight, he could only contemplate the terrible mathematics of leadership in a world where victory itself had become almost indistinguishable from catastrophe. The cherry blossoms continued their silent dance outside the windows, beautiful and ephemeral, as the President of the United States prepared to learn the secrets that would define not only the end of the Second World War, but the beginning of an entirely new and uncertain age. At whispers in the desert, the Manhattan Project. The weight of those secrets pressed down through the corridors of power like desert heat, invisible, inescapable, transforming everything it touched. While President Truman sat in his study that April evening, contemplating decisions that would reshape the world. The actual instruments of that transformation lay scattered across a vast American landscape, hidden in plain sight. In the high desert of New Mexico, where ancient mesas caught the last light of day, a different kind of cherry blossom was taking shape. Not the delicate petals that danced outside the White House windows, but something far more terrible and beautiful. The flowering of human knowledge pushed beyond all previous boundaries. The Manhattan Project had grown like a secret city within America itself. From the uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where thousands of workers processed materials they couldn't name for purposes they couldn't fathom, to the plutonium production reactors along the Columbia River at Hanford, Washington, where the very atoms were being convinced to surrender their most fundamental secrets. But it was here, in the desert stillness of Los Alamos, that theory would finally meet reality. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer moved through the evening shadows of the laboratory complex like a man carrying the weight of Prometheus himself. The theoretical physicist had become something unprecedented in human history, the scientific director of humanity's attempt to harness the power of stars. His gaunt frame and penetrating eyes reflected the intensity of a mind grappling with equations that could literally move mountains. Around him, the most brilliant scientific minds of a generation worked in carefully compartmentalized isolation. Each team knew their piece of the puzzle, but only a handful understood the complete picture. The Hungarian refugee, Leo Szilard, whose letter to Roosevelt had helped birth this entire enterprise, now found himself questioning the very monster he had helped create. Italian physicist Enrico Fermi calculated blast yields with the same methodical precision he had once applied to splitting atoms in his Chicago laboratory. The security was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Mail was censored. Telephone calls were monitored. Entire families had simply vanished from their previous lives, relocated to this high-altitude scientific monastery where the normal rules of existence had been suspended. Children attended schools where their teachers couldn't discuss their parents' work. Wives shopped in commissaries stocked by trucks that arrived from nowhere, driven by men who asked no questions. Yet beneath this blanket of secrecy, a profound moral tension was building. Many of the scientists had fled fascist Europe, driven by the terrifying possibility that Nazi Germany might develop atomic weapons first. They had thrown themselves into this work with the desperate urgency of men racing against apocalypse. But now, as spring turned towards summer in 1945, disturbing intelligence reports suggested that Germany's atomic program had never progressed beyond the theoretical stage. The original justification for their work was crumbling, even as the work itself approached its terrible culmination. Dr. Szilard found himself walking the desert paths at night, wrestling with questions that had no precedent in human experience. If the weapon wasn't needed to prevent Nazi victory, what moral authority did they have to unleash it at all? He began drafting petitions, gathering signatures from fellow scientists, arguing for a demonstration rather than direct military use. Show the world what this weapon could do, he argued. Let the mere threat of its existence end the war. But in Washington, different calculations were taking precedence. The invasion of Japan loomed like a dark star on the horizon of military planning. Operation Downfall, as it was codenamed, would require more than 1 million American troops storming beaches defended by a Japanese military establishment that had shown no inclination toward surrender. Intelligence estimates suggested American casualties could exceed 500,000. Japanese casualties. The numbers became almost meaningless in their magnitude. Against this backdrop of anticipated carnage, the atomic weapon represented something unprecedented, a way to end the war without the massive bloodletting that conventional victory would require. The terrible mathematics of warfare had never been so stark. One weapon against hundreds of thousands of lives. But first, that weapon had to work. The Trinity test site lay in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of death, a stretch of New Mexico desert so desolate that it seemed like the surface of an alien world. Here, in a landscape that had known only silence and wind for millennia, humanity would attempt to recreate the processes that powered the sun itself. The device they called the Gadget squatted on its steel tower like some malevolent technological deity. 20 feet across, bristling with cables and detonators, it contained at its heart a sphere of plutonium no larger than a baseball. But that sphere represented the distillation of 3 years of work by 130,000 people scattered across the American continent, the most expensive and ambitious scientific project in human history. As the test date approached, the tension became almost unbearable. Oppenheimer moved through the final preparations like a man walking toward his own judgment. He had been reading Hindu scripture lately, finding in ancient texts some framework for comprehending what they were about to attempt. The Bhagavad Gita spoke of moments when the divine revealed its true nature, terrible and magnificent beyond human understanding. The meteorologists tracked weather patterns with obsessive precision. The device could only be detonated under specific atmospheric conditions. Too much wind would spread radioactive fallout in unpredictable directions. Too much cloud cover would obscure the optical measurements that would determine whether the test had succeeded or failed. Betting pools sprang up among the scientists. Some wagered the device would be a complete failure, an expensive dud that would fizzle rather than explode. Others calculated yields in terms of thousands of tons of conventional explosives. A few, including the brilliant mathematician John von Neumann, suggested the explosion might be powerful enough to ignite the atmosphere itself, turning the entire planet into a brief, bright star. Fermi, with characteristic scientific detachment, began taking bets on whether the blast would destroy just New Mexico or incinerate the entire world. These were not idle academic exercises. No one truly knew what would happen when humanity crossed this particular threshold. The physics was solid in theory, but theory had never been tested on this scale. They were venturing into territory where the difference between controlled nuclear reaction and uncontrolled catastrophe might be measured in microseconds and milligrams. The final countdown began before dawn on July 16, 1945. Scientists and military observers gathered at bunkers positioned miles from ground zero, their faces pale in the pre-dawn darkness. Radio communications crackled with final systems checks. The device had been armed, the detonators were in place. Weather conditions were marginal but acceptable. Oppenheimer stood at the control bunker, his thin frame silhouetted against banks of monitoring equipment. Around him, men who had devoted years of their lives to this moment peered through dark glasses at a horizon that still showed no hint of dawn. The normal desert sounds, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the distant call of coyotes, seemed suddenly precious and fragile. At 5:29 a.m. Mountain War Time, the switch was thrown. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the desert exploded into light. Not the warm, gradual light of sunrise, but a light more brilliant than the surface of the sun itself. A light that turned night into day in an instant, casting shadows sharp as knife blades across the landscape. Men 20 miles away felt the heat wash over their faces like the opening of a furnace door. The fireball expanded with impossible speed, climbing into the sky like a luminous mountain being born. The mushroom cloud that followed rose higher than any human structure, higher than the mountains themselves, a pillar of fire and smoke that seemed to connect earth to heaven. And then, seconds later, came the sound. Not just noise, but a physical force that shook the ground beneath their feet, rattled windows hundreds of miles away, and announced to the world that something fundamental had changed. The shock wave rolled across the desert like an invisible tsunami, carrying with it the news that humanity had successfully stolen fire from the gods. In that moment, watching the artificial sunrise he had helped create, Oppenheimer later recalled that a line from the Bhagavad Gita flashed through his mind. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." The test was a complete success. The weapon worked exactly as the theories had predicted. In a single blinding instant, the Manhattan Project had transformed from scientific experiment into military reality. But success brought no celebration, only a deeper, more profound sense of responsibility. The scientists who had spent years racing to unlock atomic secrets now faced the consequences of their achievement. They had given their government a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, just as President Truman was preparing to make the most momentous decision in human history. The cherry blossoms of April had given way to the brutal heat of July, and in the New Mexico desert, where the first atomic fire had bloomed like a terrible flower, the future waited, patient and inexorable as the desert wind. And a city before the dawn, while the desert winds of New Mexico carried away the radioactive dust of Trinity, Across the Pacific Ocean, another world was stirring to life. Hiroshima awakened each morning to the sound of temple bells and the gentle clatter of wooden sandals on stone streets. The city stretched along 7 rivers that flowed like silver ribbons toward the inland sea, creating a delta of remarkable beauty where mountains met water and ancient traditions blended with the urgent demands of modern war. In the pre-dawn darkness of early August 1945, the city held nearly 350,000 souls. Most had no idea that their home had been selected from a target list that included Kyoto, Kokura, and Niigata. They knew only that summer had arrived with its familiar rhythms. The cicadas singing in the camphor trees, the humid air that clung to skin like silk, and the ever-present awareness that somewhere beyond the horizon, a war was reshaping the world. Mrs. Nakamura rose before sunrise in her small wooden house near the center of the city. A widow with 3 young children, she had learned to navigate the complexities of wartime life with quiet determination. Her husband had fallen somewhere in the Philippines, one of millions of Japanese soldiers who would never return to see the morning mist rise from the 7 rivers of home. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. The rice had to be prepared just so. The children's clothes needed mending where they had torn during yesterday's play. And always there was the question of where the next meal would come from. As the American naval blockade tightened its grip around the Japanese islands, 3 miles away, Dr. Sasaki was already at Hiroshima's Red Cross Hospital. At 25, he was one of the few doctors remaining in the city, most of his colleagues having been conscripted for military service. The hospital corridors echoed with his footsteps as he made his rounds, checking on patients who suffered not just from illness, but from the malnutrition that had become commonplace as the war dragged on. He paused at the window of the surgical ward, looking out over the city as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops. Hiroshima spread before him like a living map. The ancient Hiroshima castle standing sentinel over neighborhoods where families had lived for generations, where children still played despite the shortages, where old men still gathered to discuss philosophy and poetry, even as their nation fought for survival. The doctor had no way of knowing that American meteorologists were studying weather patterns over his city, or that Colonel Paul Tibbets was conducting final briefings for a mission that would forever change the meaning of warfare itself. In the Nakajima district, near the distinctive T-shaped bridge that served as a landmark visible from the air, Father Kleinsorge was preparing for morning mass. The German Jesuit priest had made Hiroshima his home for nearly a decade, learning to love its people with the deep affection that comes from shared daily life. He had watched children grow up, had comforted families through loss, had found in this ancient city a profound sense of purpose. His small church was modest by European standards, but it pulsed with the quiet faith of his Japanese parishioners. They came despite the growing suspicion toward foreigners, despite the food shortages that made every day a test of endurance, despite the knowledge that American B-29s flew overhead with increasing frequency, usually bound for other cities, other targets. The war had touched every family in Hiroshima, but life persisted with remarkable resilience. In the Honkawa Elementary School, teachers prepared lessons for students who attended classes in shifts. The building serving multiple schools as resources grew scarce. Children still laughed during recess. They still chased each other through playgrounds where cherry trees would bloom again come spring, if spring came at all. At the Hiroshima Prefectural Office, civil defense workers updated evacuation plans and firefighting procedures. They had studied the devastation of Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka, cities that had been reduced to ash and rubble by American incendiary raids. They knew their turn might come. But Hiroshima had been largely spared so far, leading some to whisper that perhaps the Americans were saving their beautiful city for occupation headquarters after the war ended. They could not have imagined that their city's relative preservation was indeed deliberate, but for a purpose far different from what they hoped. Miss Sasaki, no relation to the doctor, worked at the East Asia Tin Works, where civilian workers now produced military supplies. At 20, she embodied the determination that had carried Japan through nearly 4 years of total war. Her brother served somewhere in the Pacific. Her father had been killed in the fighting in Burma. Yet she rose each morning, reported to work, and contributed what she could to a cause that seemed increasingly desperate. She had learned to read the signs in the sky, the high-altitude contrails that meant American reconnaissance flights, the different engine sounds that distinguished B-29s from Japanese aircraft. Like everyone in Hiroshima, she had become an amateur meteorologist and aircraft spotter. Skills that might mean the difference between life and death when the air raid sirens wailed. The Reverend Tanimoto moved through the early morning streets with the purposeful stride of a man who had found his calling in service to others. His small Methodist church served a community that had learned to support each other through increasingly difficult times. He organized food distributions, provided comfort to families who had lost sons and fathers, and maintained a quiet hope that somehow peace might yet come without total destruction. As he walked, he passed the familiar landmarks of his adopted city. The Aioi Bridge, with its distinctive T-shape, stood as it had for decades, a symbol of Hiroshima's role as a crossroads of commerce and culture. The Ota River flowed beneath it with the same gentle persistence it had shown for centuries, carrying the runoff from distant mountains to the sea, indifferent to human conflict. The Reverend had no way of knowing that this very bridge had been selected as the aiming point for a weapon that would redefine the relationship between humanity and the forces of nature itself. In military barracks throughout the city, soldiers prepared for another day of training and preparation. The 2nd General Army, headquartered in Hiroshima, was responsible for defending the southern approaches to Japan's home islands. They studied maps, conducted exercises, and planned for the American invasion that intelligence suggested was inevitable. These men, many of them barely out of their teens, understood that they might be asked to fight to the death for their homeland. They had been raised on stories of samurai honor and national duty. Yet many also harbored private doubts about a war that had already consumed so much, that had taken friends, brothers, fathers into the vast Pacific, and returned only telegrams bearing news of glorious deaths in distant places. As the morning progressed, Hiroshima settled into its wartime rhythm. Ration lines formed outside government distribution centers. Workers reported to factories that had been converted from peacetime production to military necessities. Students attended classes where they learned not just mathematics and literature, but also air raid procedures and basic military training. The city hummed with the subdued energy of a community under siege, yet determined to preserve what it could of normal life. Mothers still sang lullabies to their children. Elderly men still practiced calligraphy in quiet gardens. Young couples still found moments of tenderness despite the uncertainty that shadowed every tomorrow. 8,000 miles away, on a small island called Tinian, ground crews were making final preparations for a mission designated simply as Special Bombing Mission Number 13. The B-29 superfortress that would carry out this mission had been named Enola Gay, after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets. The weapon itself, a uranium bomb called Little Boy, waited in a specially constructed loading pit. At 10 feet long and weighing nearly 10,000 pounds, it represented the culmination of 3 years of unprecedented scientific and industrial effort. The minds that had conceived it were brilliant. The hands that had built it were skilled. Yet none of them could fully comprehend what they had created, or what it would mean for the people of Hiroshima when morning came again. As the sun climbed higher over the 7 rivers of Hiroshima, casting long shadows between the wooden houses and narrow streets, the city continued its daily dance between hope and resignation. Children walked to school past gardens where vegetables grew in place of flowers, a practical adaptation to wartime necessity. Shopkeepers opened stores that held fewer goods each week, yet still served as gathering places where neighbors could share news and offer mutual support. The morning of August 6, 1945, was beginning much like any other, with the quiet determination of people who had learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness, small moments of beauty, small gestures of defiance against the chaos that surrounded them. They could not know that in a few hours their city would become the first to experience the full fury of atomic warfare, and that their lives would mark the boundary between one age of human history and another. Potsdam, decisions in the shadow of war. But across the world, in a villa overlooking Lake Griebnitz near Berlin, another kind of mourning was beginning. The sun rose over the war-torn German countryside, casting long shadows across the grounds of Sicilienhof Palace, where three men would gather to reshape the world. President Harry Truman had arrived in Potsdam carrying secrets that weighed heavier than any briefing book. In his pocket was a telegram from Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a single coded phrase that would change everything. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. Trinity had succeeded. The atomic bomb was no longer theoretical. The palace itself seemed almost absurdly peaceful for such momentous decisions. Built in the style of an English Tudor manor, its red brick walls and ivy-covered facades suggested country weekends rather than the redrawing of continents. But the security was unmistakable. American MPs, British guards, and Soviet soldiers creating concentric rings of protection around the men who would decide the fate of nations. Truman walked the gardens in the early morning hours before the day's sessions began. The weight of knowledge pressed down on him with each step along the gravel paths. He had been president for barely 3 months, thrust into a role he had never sought, carrying responsibilities that Roosevelt had never fully shared with him. And now he alone would decide whether to unleash a weapon that could end the war in days or change the nature of warfare forever. The previous day's meetings had been cordial enough on the surface. Stalin, compact and methodical, speaking through interpreters while his dark eyes missed nothing. Churchill, expansive and eloquent, already sensing the political winds shifting back home in Britain. And Truman himself, the former haberdasher from Missouri, trying to project confidence while learning statecraft in real time. But beneath the diplomatic pleasantries lay fundamental disagreements about the post-war world. Stalin wanted security, a buffer of friendly states between Russia and any future threat from the West. Churchill wanted to preserve the British Empire and contain Soviet expansion. And Truman wanted to end the war without sacrificing another 100,000 American lives on the beaches of Japan. The intelligence estimates were sobering. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would begin with Olympic. The assault on Kyushu scheduled for November. Military planners projected casualties that made even hardened generals pause. Some estimates suggested 1 million Allied casualties, with Japanese losses potentially reaching into the millions as well. General Marshall had briefed him on the Japanese defensive preparations. Every beach fortified, every hill turned into a strongpoint. Civilians being trained to fight with bamboo spears and improvised weapons. The kamikaze attacks that had bloodied the Pacific Fleet were nothing compared to what awaited an invasion force, when an entire nation had been mobilized for suicidal resistance. But the atomic bomb offered another path, a demonstration of such overwhelming power that even the most fanatical Japanese militarists would have to acknowledge reality. One bomb, perhaps two, and Japan would surrender without the need for invasion. The war could end in August rather than dragging into 1946 or beyond. Truman paused by the lake, watching the morning mist rise from the water. The irony was not lost on him. Here he sat in the ruins of Hitler's Reich, surrounded by the devastation of conventional warfare, contemplating the use of a weapon that could make all previous destruction seem almost quaint by comparison. The scientists at Los Alamos had provided technical briefings, but their clinical language could not fully convey the reality. A single bomb with the explosive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. A fireball that would vaporize everything within a mile. Radiation effects that were still not fully understood. They were crossing a threshold, and once crossed, there would be no going back. During the morning session, Stalin pressed for Soviet entry into the war against Japan. He had promised to attack within 3 months of Germany's surrender, and that deadline was approaching rapidly. Soviet forces were already massing in Manchuria, preparing to sweep aside the Japanese Kwantung Army. But if the atomic bomb could end the war quickly, would Soviet intervention even be necessary? The political calculations were becoming as complex as the military ones. Roosevelt had desperately wanted Soviet help against Japan when the war seemed likely to drag on for years. But now, Soviet entry might simply mean Stalin would demand a voice in Japan's occupation. The atomic bomb offered the possibility of ending the war before the Soviets could establish facts on the ground in Asia. Truman found himself studying Stalin during the afternoon discussions about Poland and Eastern Europe. The Soviet leaders' demands were non-negotiable. Governments friendly to Moscow, territorial adjustments, massive reparations from Germany. The wartime alliance was already showing cracks. And those cracks would only widen once the common enemy was defeated. Churchill sensed it too. During a private moment, the Prime Minister had spoken quietly about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe. The Soviets were consolidating control over Poland, Hungary, Romania, creating the buffer zone that Stalin believed essential for Soviet security. But from the Western perspective, it looked like the replacement of Nazi tyranny with communist dictatorship. The atomic bomb was changing these calculations in ways that were only beginning to become clear. American possession of such a weapon would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the post-war world. The United States would no longer need to rely on allies for security, or accept Soviet demands backed by the Red Army's presence in Eastern Europe. But with that power came isolation. Truman was beginning to understand that the decision to use the atomic bomb would be his alone. Congress had not been consulted. The American people knew nothing of the weapon's existence. Even most of his own cabinet remained in the dark. The choice would rest with one man, carrying the weight of history and the responsibility for consequences that could not be fully foreseen. That evening, as the formal sessions ended, Truman received another coded message. The components for the second bomb were being assembled on Tinian Island. Weather forecasts for early August looked favorable. Everything was proceeding according to schedule, but the final authorization still required his signature. He walked the palace corridors late into the night, past portraits of German royalty who had once believed their power eternal. The parallels were uncomfortable. Rulers making decisions that would echo through generations, convinced of their righteousness but unable to see the full consequences of their choices. The Potsdam Declaration was taking shape, a final ultimatum to Japan demanding unconditional surrender. The language was deliberately stark. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. But the declaration would not mention the atomic bomb specifically. Japan's leaders would have to decide based on conventional military logic, unaware that the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed. Truman understood the cruel irony. Japan's government was already seeking ways to end the war, but their diplomatic overtures came through Moscow, and Stalin had no incentive to facilitate a Japanese surrender before Soviet forces could enter the Pacific War. The Japanese were essentially negotiating with an intermediary who wanted the war to continue just long enough to serve Soviet interests. Meanwhile, time was running short for any alternative to the atomic bomb. Each day of delay meant more American casualties in the ongoing Pacific campaigns, more Japanese civilians dying under conventional bombing, more Soviet preparation for intervention that could complicate the peace. The weight of decision pressed down on him as he finally retired to his quarters. Tomorrow would bring more diplomatic discussions, more careful verbal fencing between allies who were already becoming rivals. But underneath all the formal negotiations lay a simple, terrible choice: whether to use a weapon that could end the war instantly, but at a cost that no one could fully calculate. In a few days, he would return to Washington, and the moment of decision would arrive. The orders were already drafted, target selection completed, crews trained and ready. All that remained was his signature on the authorization, and the world would discover what humanity had learned to do to itself. The palace settled into quiet around him, but sleep would not come easily. History was watching and waiting. The unfolding aftermath. The authorization came on August 6th at 2:45 in the morning, local time on Tinian Island. Colonel Paul Tibbets had named his B-29 after his mother, Enola Gay, a gesture both tender and terrible for what the aircraft was about to accomplish. The crew had been briefed. The weather was acceptable, and the primary target remained Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m. Japanese time, the world changed. The flash lasted only microseconds, but its implications would endure for generations. Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot of the Enola Gay, would later write in his log, "My God, what have we done?" The mushroom cloud rose to 30,000 feet, then 40, then 50, a monument to human ingenuity and human destruction rising into the morning sky over Japan. In Washington, the first reports were clinical, almost antiseptic. Mission accomplished successfully. Primary target engaged. Crew returning to base. The language of military efficiency, masking the reality that a single weapon had just killed more people than most battles of the entire war. President Truman was aboard the USS Augusta, returning from Potsdam when the news reached him. Captain Frank Graham handed him the coded message at lunch, and Truman read it twice before the magnitude settled in. "This is the greatest thing in history," he told the gathered officers, but his private writings would later reveal a more complex reaction. Relief, yes, that the weapon worked as promised, but also a growing awareness that America had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The initial damage assessments were fragmentary. Confused, radio communications from Hiroshima had simply stopped. Reconnaissance flights reported widespread fires, but the full scope of destruction wouldn't be understood for days. What was immediately clear was that a single airplane, carrying a single bomb, had accomplished what previously required hundreds of bombers and thousands of tons of conventional explosives. In Tokyo, the Japanese leadership struggled to comprehend the reports filtering in from Hiroshima. General Anami, the war minister, initially dismissed early accounts as exaggerated, the product of panic and confusion. But as more information arrived, as the scale of devastation became undeniable, a terrible realization began to take hold. The Americans possessed a weapon that could erase entire cities, and Japan had no defense against it. Emperor Hirohito received his first detailed briefing on August 7th. The man who had been portrayed to his people as divine sat in silence as military advisors described the destruction of Hiroshima, 60,000 buildings destroyed or damaged, casualty estimates climbing by the hour, and the growing certainty that this was indeed a single bomb, not a massive conventional raid. The emperor's private secretary would later record that His Majesty asked only one question: how many of these weapons do the Americans possess? The answer, that no one knew, hung in the room like a death sentence for the Japanese war effort. On August 8th, as Japan still reeled from Hiroshima, Stalin delivered another devastating blow. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan, exactly 3 months after Germany's surrender, just as Stalin had promised at Yalta. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria, Japan's most experienced remaining force, suddenly faced the full weight of Soviet mechanized divisions. The timing was not coincidental. Stalin had been preparing for this moment, waiting for the optimal strategic window. The atomic bomb had accelerated his timeline, the Soviet leader understanding that the war might end before he could claim his share of the spoils. Within hours of the declaration, over 1 million Soviet troops poured across the Manchurian border. For Japan's military leadership, this represented the collapse of their final strategic hope. They had counted on Soviet mediation, on Moscow's potential role as an intermediary for negotiated peace terms. Now that hope lay in ruins. Along with the city of Hiroshima, the second bomb fell on August 9th, on Nagasaki. The primary target had been Kokura, but cloud cover forced Major Charles Sweeney to divert to the secondary target. Fat Man, the plutonium implosion device, detonated at 11:02 a.m. local time, adding another 40,000 casualties to the atomic ledger. This time, the reports reached Tokyo more quickly. The Japanese government could no longer dismiss the attacks as isolated incidents, or hope that America possessed only a single weapon. The pattern was clear and terrifying. The Americans could and would continue destroying Japanese cities until the empire surrendered unconditionally. In the basement of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito convened an emergency meeting of the Supreme War Council. The 6 most powerful men in Japan, gathered around a simple wooden table, faced the reality that their nation's position had become untenable. The atomic bombs had not just destroyed cities, they had destroyed the mathematical foundation of Japanese resistance. General Anami, still advocating for continued resistance, argued that Japan could absorb even atomic attacks if the alternative was national dishonor. But his words carried less conviction now, the weight of Hiroshima and Nagasaki pressing down on the room like a physical presence. Foreign Minister Togo, long an advocate for peace, spoke quietly but firmly about the need to end the war before more cities vanished in atomic fire. The emperor listened, his face revealing nothing, as his advisors debated the future of Japan. Outside, American B-29s continued their conventional bombing campaigns, but everyone in that room understood that the atomic weapons had fundamentally altered the strategic equation. Each day of delay risked another Hiroshima, another Nagasaki. Meanwhile, on Tinian Island, the crews of the 509th Composite Group were processing their own reactions to what they had accomplished. The men who had delivered the atomic bombs were not monsters. They were ordinary Americans who had been trained for an extraordinary mission. Many struggled with the magnitude of destruction they had witnessed. The knowledge that their actions had killed more civilians in minutes than most soldiers would see die in years of combat. Captain Theodore Van Kirk, navigator of the Enola Gay, would later describe the flight home as the longest of his life. The crew had completed their mission successfully, but the sight of that mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima had left them all changed. They had crossed a line that no military personnel had ever crossed before, and the weight of that distinction would stay with them forever. The debriefings were thorough, technical, focused on operational details rather than moral implications. How accurate was the bomb placement? What were the observed effects? How did the aircraft perform under the mission's unique stresses? The questions were practical, but underneath lay deeper uncertainties about what America had become and what it might need to become to win future wars. In Los Alamos, the scientists who had created the bombs received confirmation that their theoretical work had achieved devastating practical results. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, felt the full weight of his Sanskrit quotation from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." The physics had worked perfectly, but the human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Some scientists celebrated, viewing the bomb's success as validation of years of intensive research and development. Others, like Leo Szilard, who had initially proposed the atomic bomb program, now questioned whether the weapons should have been used against populated targets. The scientific community that had united to defeat Nazi Germany found itself divided over the moral implications of their achievement. The bombs had ended the war, or would soon, but they had also introduced a new category of weapon into human warfare. The scientists who understood the physics best also understood the implications most clearly. Atomic weapons could be made more powerful, more efficient, more numerous. The bombs dropped on Japan were not the end of atomic warfare, they were the beginning. By August 10th, intercepted Japanese communications suggested that the emperor was preparing to announce surrender. The combination of atomic destruction and Soviet invasion had accomplished what years of conventional bombing and naval blockade had not: the complete collapse of Japanese resistance. But even as victory approached, American leaders were beginning to grapple with the post-war implications of atomic weapons. Secretary of War Stimson, who had overseen the Manhattan Project from its inception, found himself contemplating a world where multiple nations possessed atomic capabilities. The American monopoly on atomic weapons would not last forever, and when other powers developed their own bombs, the strategic landscape would become infinitely more complex and dangerous. The war was ending, but a new era was beginning. An era where human civilization possessed the technical capability to destroy itself, and where the prevention of atomic warfare would become the paramount challenge of international diplomacy. The bombs that ended World War II had also begun the Cold War, though few yet understood the full implications of that transition. The Enola Gay touched down on Tinian at 2:58 p.m., mission complete, crew safe, and the world forever changed. Surrender and reflection. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council convened in emergency session on the morning of August 9th. Even as Fat Man was falling toward Nagasaki, the 6 men who comprised Japan's highest military authority faced a reality that their strategic doctrine had never contemplated. Prime Minister Suzuki, War Minister Anami, Navy Minister Yonai, Army Chief of Staff Umezu, Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda, and Foreign Minister Togo gathered in the underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, their faces drawn with exhaustion and the weight of impossible choices. The reports from Hiroshima had been fragmentary at first, then increasingly horrific. A single bomb, an entire city center obliterated, casualties in the tens of thousands from one aircraft, one weapon. General Anami, the war minister who had spent months preparing for the decisive battle on Japanese soil, stared at intelligence photographs that defied comprehension. The Americans possessed perhaps dozens of these weapons, perhaps hundreds. The mathematics of resistance had fundamentally changed. Foreign Minister Togo had been advocating surrender through Soviet mediation for weeks. But that avenue had closed with Stalin's declaration of war and the Red Army's lightning advance into Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, Japan's elite force in China, was collapsing faster than anyone had thought possible. The strategic situation that had seemed desperate in July now appeared utterly hopeless in August. Emperor Hirohito, breaking with centuries of imperial tradition, had already indicated his willingness to consider surrender. But the military leadership remained divided. The concept of surrender was so alien to their training, their culture, their understanding of duty, that some could barely form the words. They had prepared for death. They had prepared to take millions of Americans with them in the invasion of the home islands. But they had not prepared for this. The debate stretched through the morning and into the afternoon. War Minister Anami argued that Japan could still extract concessions, still preserve some measure of honor through continued resistance. The atomic bombs were terrible, yes, but perhaps the Americans had only two. Perhaps the invasion could still be made so costly that terms could be negotiated. But as reports arrived of Nagasaki's destruction, even this desperate hope began to fade. Navy Minister Yonai, who had opposed the war from its beginning, spoke quietly of the reality they faced. Japan's cities were defenseless against conventional bombing. Now they were defenseless against weapons that could erase them entirely. The home island's food situation was desperate. The blockade was complete. The Soviet entry meant the end of any hope for negotiated peace. Continuing the war meant the potential extinction of the Japanese people as a functioning society. The emperor's voice, when he finally spoke at the imperial conference that evening, was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 2,000 years of imperial authority. "The time has come when we must bear the unbearable," he said, his words carefully chosen, each one falling like a stone into still water. The decision for surrender would be his, as the decision for war had been his, and he would carry both for the remainder of his days. In Washington, President Truman waited for word from Tokyo with the same mixture of hope and dread that had characterized every major decision since April. The reports from Nagasaki confirmed that the second bomb had achieved its intended effect, but whether Japan would surrender remained uncertain. Intelligence suggested deep divisions within the Japanese leadership, and Truman knew that every day of delay meant more deaths, more suffering, more destruction. Secretary of War Stimson found the president in the Oval Office on the evening of August the 10th, reading casualty reports from the Pacific Theater. The planned invasion of Kyushu was still scheduled for November, and the estimates remained staggering. Operation Downfall would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. The atomic bombs, terrible as they were, represented the lesser of catastrophic evils. "Mr. President," Stimson said quietly, "we've received word through Swiss diplomatic channels. The Japanese are prepared to surrender, with one condition: they wish to retain the emperor." Truman set down the papers and rubbed his eyes. The condition was not unexpected, but it presented its own complexities. American public opinion demanded unconditional surrender. The families of Pearl Harbor victims, of Bataan survivors, of the thousands who had died in Japanese prisoner of war camps. They wanted justice, not negotiation. But the emperor's retention might be the key to preventing a guerrilla war that could last for years. "What does MacArthur recommend?" Truman asked. "The general believes the emperor's cooperation will be essential for governing occupied Japan," Stimson replied. "His endorsement of surrender could prevent continued resistance. His opposition could make occupation impossible." The president walked to the window, looking out at the late summer evening in Washington. Somewhere in the Pacific, American forces were still fighting and dying. Somewhere in Japan, civilians were still suffering under the blockade and bombing. The power to end it all rested in this room, in his decision, in words that would echo through history. The Japanese surrender broadcast came at noon on August 15th, Tokyo time, the emperor's voice reaching his people through radio waves that carried across the devastated home islands. His words were formal, ritualistic, couched in the classical language of imperial proclamation, but their meaning was unmistakable. Japan would endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable in accepting defeat. In Hiroshima, the survivors, who could still move, gathered around radios in the ruins of their city. Listening to their emperor's voice announced the end of the war that had brought such devastation to their lives. Mrs. Nakamura, her burns slowly healing, held her children close as the formal phrases washed over them. The war was over, but their suffering would continue for years, decades, lifetimes. Dr. Sasaki, working without rest in the makeshift hospitals that had replaced the destroyed medical facilities, paused in his treatment of radiation sickness victims to hear the announcement. The emperor spoke of a new and most cruel bomb that threatened the total extinction of human civilization. The doctor, who had seen that cruelty firsthand, understood that his emperor spoke truth, but also that this truth had come too late for thousands of his patients. In the United States, the news brought celebrations in the streets, but also quiet reflection in the corridors of power. The Manhattan Project scientists at Los Alamos received word of Japan's surrender with complex emotions. Their work had achieved its intended purpose. The war was ending without invasion, but they had also introduced humanity to weapons of unprecedented destructive power. The nuclear age they had created would outlast them all. President Truman addressed the nation on the evening of August 15th, his voice carrying across a country that had been at war for nearly 4 years. "This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor," he began, but his tone was more subdued than triumphant. The victory had come at a cost that was still being calculated. In American lives, in Japanese lives, in the moral complexity of decisions that no human being should have to make. In his private moments that evening, Truman reflected on the path that had brought him to this point. 4 months earlier, he had been a vice president kept in the dark about the most significant military program in American history. Now he was the only human being who had authorized the use of nuclear weapons in warfare, a distinction he hoped would remain unique throughout history. The weight of that decision would never leave him. In years to come, as the Cold War developed and nuclear arsenals multiplied, he would be asked repeatedly whether he regretted the choice to use the atomic bombs. His answer would remain consistent. He had chosen the option that ended the war most quickly and saved the most lives. But he would also work to ensure that nuclear weapons would never again be used in anger. The letters from Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors would arrive in later years, some filled with hatred, others with understanding, all carrying the human cost of his decision. He would read them all, filing them carefully in his personal papers, carrying their weight as part of the burden of leadership in the atomic age. As August faded into September and the formal surrender ceremony approached, the world began to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. The war that had consumed 6 years and claimed perhaps 50 million lives was ending. But the peace that followed would be shaped by the weapons that had forced that ending. The atomic bombs that had brought Japan to surrender had also announced America's emergence as the dominant global power, and had begun the nuclear competition that would define the next half-century. The USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, prepared to host the surrender ceremony that would formally end World War II. General MacArthur, who would accept Japan's surrender, understood that he was presiding over more than the end of a war. He was witnessing the beginning of a new era in human history, an era where the ultimate weapons existed, and where the wisdom to avoid using them would become humanity's greatest challenge. On September 2, 1945, Japanese officials in formal dress climbed aboard the Missouri to sign the instruments of surrender, their faces masks of controlled emotion as they acknowledged their nation's defeat. The ceremony was brief, formal, witnessed by representatives of all the Allied powers, but its significance extended far beyond the legal ending of hostilities. As the Japanese delegation departed and the Allied flags flew over Tokyo Bay, President Truman's voice once again reached the American people through radio waves that carried his words across a continent finally at peace. "The evil done by the Japanese warlords can never be repaired or forgotten," he said. but their power to destroy and kill has been taken from them. In the quiet hours that followed, as the sun set over Tokyo Bay and the last echoes of celebration faded into evening stillness, the world began its long journey toward understanding what had happened in those crucial days of August 1945, when the atomic age began with the flash of light over Hiroshima, when humanity crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, when the decisions of a few individuals in Washington and Tokyo determined the fate of millions and established the parameters of power for generations yet unborn. And as the waves lapped gently against the hull of the Missouri and the stars emerged over the Pacific, the Great War finally ended, leaving behind its lessons about the terrible cost of conflict and the precious value of peace. Lessons that would echo through the decades to come as the world learned to live with the awesome power that human ingenuity had unleashed and human wisdom would now be called upon to control.